Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sean Healy. I work at the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, and very pleased to welcome you to a book discussion with author Akil Amar on his discussion of America's written Constitution. Remind you to join us on Twitter, join the conversation on Twitter, tweet using the hashtag Akil Amar, both commenting on our conversation and also putting forth questions. And as this conversation goes, I'll attempt to integrate some of the questions that we receive via the Twitter feed into this conversation. Just a couple of things before I introduce Professor Amar. One, a bit about the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, who is hosting Professor Amar's talk. The foundation's committed to fostering communities of educated, informed, and engaged citizens. We do that through a number of philanthropic programs. We have a park out in the western suburbs of Chicago called Cantini Park, a couple of museums out there. Encourage you to visit our website, mccormickfoundation.org, to learn much more about this organization. We're privileged today to be hosting the Midwestern gathering of the James Madison Fellowship. Welcome fellows from across the country and throughout the world who are tuned in to today's simulcast. If you don't know much about the fellowship, I encourage you once again to visit the website jamesmadison.org. Fellowship's been in existence since 1986. It was founded by Congress with the intention of strengthening the teaching of the Constitution in secondary schools across the country. With us today are 16 different fellows from throughout the Midwestern states of Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. This is our second of what we hope to have annual gatherings of the fellowship, and the foundation has encouraged, the Madison Foundation has encouraged similar gatherings like this to occur throughout the country during the summer months. There's about 1,200 constitutional teacher scholars that have benefited from the fellowship since its inception. And then finally, just my great privilege to introduce Akil Amar. He's the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches both constitutional law, Yale College, and Yale Law School. Received his BA, who was summa cum laude, in 1980 from Yale College, and his JD, also from Yale Law School, in 1984, where he served as editor of the Law Journal. Clerked for then Judge Stephen Breyer on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, and joined the Yale faculty in 1985. Professor Amar is the co-editor of the leading constitutional law casebook, Processes of Constitutional Decision-Making, also the author of several books, including the Constitution and Criminal Procedure, First Principles, the Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction, America's Constitution, a Biography, and of course, the book that we're here to discuss today, most recently, last fall, the release of America's Unwritten Constitution, The Precedents and Principles We Live By, which was published by Basic Books. It's a great privilege to welcome Professor Amar to Chicago, invite him to share some comments about the book, and then, of course, engage in a conversation about the book. Professor Amar, welcome.
Thank you so much for hosting me. Thank you all for being here, actually and or virtually. The book, America's Unwritten Constitution, I just maybe want to say a couple things about it and then have a conversation. The first is that it was written for my fellow citizens, not just for law professor types. It was written at one end for ambitious 17-year-olds taking AP History, AP Government, your students, and therefore it was also written for you, people teaching AP History and AP Government. And those of you who aren't teaching AP History and AP Government, it was also written for you just because it's written for citizens who want to deepen their civic understanding. And also for journalists, for public opinion leaders, but not just for law students and law professors, although I hope they might benefit from some of the things I have to say also. The only other thing I think I want to say is that this book, America's Unwritten Constitution, is a sequel to a book, America's Constitution, a Biography, The first book, which came out in 2005, tries to walk the same audience, AP history and AP government students and college undergraduates and high school teachers and civics leaders at one end and law professors and law students at the other end, tries to walk that audience, the first book does, America's Constitution, a Biography, through the written Constitution from start to finish. First the preamble, then the articles in sequence, Article 1, the legislature, Article 2, the judiciary, the executive, Article 3, the judiciary, Article 4, the states, Articles 5, 6, and 7 about constitutional supremacy. It walks the reader in textual order through the written Constitution, reaches the end of the original Constitution, and then tracks again in textual order the remainder of the text, a series of amendments, the first 10, which we call the Bill of Rights, the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15, the Progressive Era amendments, direct income taxation, direct election of senators, women's suffrage, and then later 20th century amendments like the abolition of poll taxes for certain elections, the 18-year-old vote. So in the course of following that textual order, the book also, in effect, carries the story forward in time. We first get a picture of the original Constitution circa 1788, and then, because the amendments were added chronologically as so many postscripts and PPSs, postscripts and PPPSs, and so on, like a careless written letter, in the phrase of one a critic. Because the amendments are added chronologically and sequentially, the narrative of that book has ultimately a chronological thrust to it, in which we move from the founding through the Civil War and the 20th century. That book, if you had a chance to read it, I hope would persuade you that there is so much richness in the written Constitution, that is the sheet anchor of the American constitutional project, that is the center of American constitutionalism. This terse text, this written document, is less than 8,000 words, including all the amendments. I don't want to take anything back in this sequel book from what I said in that book about the significance of the written Constitution. But this new book is designed to show that we have to, in a variety of ways, go beneath, beyond, behind the written Constitution. And here's the trick: without ever losing connection to, faith with, the written text. The written text, in order to fully work in America, has to be supplemented in certain ways. It doesn't say separation of powers, even though that's part of our system. It doesn't say federalism. It doesn't say the rule of law or limited government. It doesn't say one person, one vote. And sometimes what it actually says, when you read it in a flat-footed way, it doesn't quite mean. Read literally, who presides, what does the Constitution say about who presides at the vice president's impeachment? Read literally, the Senate presides over impeachments, that's what it says, and the vice president presides over the Senate, that's what it says. So the vice president would preside over his own impeachment, and that can't be right. And when I say that can't be right, I don't think I'm making stuff up, nor do I think I'm saying things that actually liberals would accept and conservatives not, or vice versa. I think actually almost all judges and justices would, upon deep reflection, realize that there are deep principles having to do with the rule of law, which means that no person can be a judge in his own case. That's an implicit principle that helps inform the written Constitution, and therefore the Constitution actually doesn't quite mean what its words seem to mean, one by one, sentence by sentence, when read without attention to its larger themes. Now, if I've persuaded you in the first few pages of this new book that actually the Constitution sometimes means the opposite of what it first seems to, I should have unsettled you to a very great extent, because now, well, what are the rules? When can we go beyond it and behind it and beneath it? How do we avoid losing faith with it? That's the project of this second book, to try to show you, and it's organized differently than the last one, which was organized around the flow and the architecture and organization of the text. This new book is organized around tools and techniques, legal tools and techniques that conservatives as well as liberals on the court and off actually believe in and practice. Tools and techniques by which we can go beyond narrow literalism and yet maintain fidelity, faithfulness to the larger constitutional project. So each chapter tries to introduce you to a different way of going behind the words without losing a connection to them. That's the basic organizing idea of this book. And I think that probably is enough to get us started, I hope.
Questions from the group?
How would it be different if Madison would have prevailed in the Bill of Rights and putting them into the body of the document?
I think that's a brilliant question. So everyone could hear the question, right? What difference would it have made if Madison's idea to basically add amendments in a word processing-like way, to just rewrite the original Constitution and fold in new words? How would the project be different had he prevailed? He didn't. Now, why didn't he prevail, by the way? Because Roger Sherman objected to that mode, and Madison was clever enough to realize that if he basically could win on substance, he should give way on style, just so Sherman would not be, would be inside the tent peeing out rather than outside the tent peeing in. He understood that you have to bring people on board in a democracy. The entire project of a Bill of Rights, forget its substance for just a second. Here's what it accomplishes brilliantly procedurally. It gets the people who oppose the Constitution to buy in, to feel that they were part of the thing, state by state, and some states haven't ratified, North Carolina and Rhode Island. So if you can, this is very difficult. You have to win, but you have to win in a way that keeps the losers on board. This is a very difficult thing to do in a democracy. Think about Egypt today or something, not freezing out the losers. So the Anti-Federalists lose round one, called the ratification, but Madison sort of reels them in and say, you wanted a Bill of Rights? Okay, I'll give you something. Maybe it's not going to be everything you wanted. Let's compromise on the things that together we can agree on. But brilliantly, he brings them into the project. And they will become these anti-federalists. Presidents of the United States, James Monroe, and vice presidents, Elbridge Gerry and George Clinton, and justices on the Supreme Court. So, too, he wants Sherman in the end. You want this guy on your side. This is a powerful guy. He comes from a different part of the country, from New England. He's a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, only one of 6. He actually also signed the Articles of Confederation, I think the only one to sign all 3 documents. And he thinks you can't word process the thing. And he makes a bunch of arguments, and actually Sherman's arguments are bogus. They actually don't persuade, and Madison, who's smart, kind of understand. But okay, fine, this guy thinks it's important. It's not that important to me. Maybe give way on style in order to accomplish many of my other purposes. One other thing, and then I'll answer the question. State constitutions are very similar to the federal in many ways. The last chapter of this book talks about state constitutions, the 50 state constitutions. Many of them, most of them, actually weave the amendments into the main text rather than have them tacked on at the end, as so many postscripts and post-postscripts. So the American constitutional project, I think could have gone the Madison route, and most states actually do that. And I mention that because, one, we can get deep wisdom about the federal Constitution by thinking about the ways in which it's similar to and yet slightly different from its state counterparts. That's actually the last chapter. States as laboratories, constitutional laboratories, and what can we learn from them? Here's, in a sentence or two, what happened. So it's just a coincidence, or it's contingent that we added the amendments at the end. How has our project been different as a result? One, we actually create a thing, in effect, called the Bill of Rights. That these first 10, because they're all together, proximate textually to each other, gain a certain strength by the fact that they're all in the same neighborhood. Location, location, location. The phrase, the Bill of Rights, doesn't appear in the document. It's unwritten, and yet we think it's this thing because Amendments 1 to 10 actually have their own little neighborhood textually and location. So in some ways it's stronger. Madison didn't maybe understand that, but in some ways it's strong. But here's the second and big thing. Amendments come along later on, and they have deep transformative logics to them. but they don't fully specify the gravitational pull of their amendatory logic. Just how much of the earlier Constitution needs to be, in effect, reinterpreted because of a later amendment. That's one of the biggest challenges of unwritten constitutionalism, is because the Constitution is an intergenerational project, how much do we need to reinterpret earlier texts in light of later ones that get tacked on that don't completely reword all the earlier ones? Here are two of the biggest features of an unwritten Constitution. One, what are the tools and techniques of interpretation? The Constitution doesn't tell us how it's to be interpreted. Just literally, if not literally, is structural interpretation, holistic, okay? What about original intent interpretation, modern day meanings? It doesn't tell us quite how to be interpreted. That's unwritten, the rules of interpretation. Second, it doesn't quite tell us how to think about later amendments that may be revolutionary. If you're a Christian, I happen to be one, how much of the Old Testament do you need to reinterpret in light of the life and death and resurrection and ministry of Jesus Christ? Okay, because the Old Testament has a lot of scary stuff in it that I actually don't think survives Jesus' ministry. But just how much do he reinterprets the Ten Commandments, and he actually says, well, the first one's pretty important, but the rest, it's really, this other one, not in so many words, but the deep idea is to love your neighbor, as yourself. And so it's a reinterpretation of the earlier text. The New Testament is. And these amendments come along. How much of the earlier text do you have to reinterpret when Lincoln's generation comes along and ends slavery, which was a huge feature of the original Constitution? And slavery is actually built into provisions about direct taxation, and how do you reinterpret that once there's no longer slavery? Women's suffrage comes along. Now, does that 19th Amendment say in so many words that women get to be president? It says women get to vote, but doesn't quite say they get to be president. And the original Constitution says he, him, his when it comes to the presidency. Article 2 says he, him, his. And they always talked about at the founding whether presidents could be kings, and no one talked about whether the president could, would be like a queen. And they had queens. Virginia's named for a queen. William and Mary is named for, a king and a queen. So they knew queens. And they never talked about whether presidents would be queens. They always talked about whether presidents would be like kings. And they used he, him, his. But I say, after the 19th Amendment, we can't read he, him, his literally. We have to read it generically. That if a state today said, we're not going to let women's names appear on the presidential ballot, that would be an unconstitutional statute, even though at the founding that's clearly constitutional for them to do that. They all, in fact, did. And the 19th Amendment, I think, changes that, but not in so many words. And if we had reword processed the document, we probably would have confronted, when we came up to Article 2, gee, should we say he or she or something? But we didn't do that. We didn't rewrite the thing start to finish. And so how much of the old needs to be reinterpreted in light of the later amendments? The 14th Amendment says that if a state disfranchises certain folks, that will lose seats in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. But it says male. Does that need to be reinterpreted now, once the 19th Amendment comes along? It says 21. Do you need to reinterpret that once the 18-year-old vote amendment comes along? This is one of the biggest challenges of our constitutional project. I believe, for example, that the Supreme Court's invalidation recently of the Voting Rights Act, the big thing that distinguished the 5 from the 4 is the 4 read the Reconstruction amendments sort of as much more generative. The 5 said federal oversight of the states is really a violation of kind of states' rights ideas, and that's a founding point of view, which is very pro-states' rights. And they said it's unusual and weird and eccentric to have federal preclearance. I say, no, it's not unusual and weird and eccentric. That's actually what the 14th Amendment was all about. The federal government bringing states into line because they had misbehaved. That's not some weird exception. That's like the new normal because the 14th Amendment was transformative. The First Amendment begins with the words, Congress shall make no law, ... And the Tea Party says, yes, just Congress shall make no law, period, exclamation point, no law of any sort. But the 10th Amendment ends with states' rights. The original Bill of Rights is more of a states' rights document, more anti-federalist, because you've just fought a revolution against an imperial center. But the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, thereafter you just fought a war in which the good guys are the central government, the Union. And they end with the words, 13th does, Congress shall have power. 14th Amendment, Congress shall have power. 15th Amendment, Congress shall have power. And so, but because we didn't reword process the whole document, what I just said is a contestable interpretation. I happen to believe in it, but the 5 justices in the majority didn't. They basically tried to I would say, trivialize or cabin the Reconstruction amendments to sort of their narrow time and place rather than see them as generative of, in a phrase, a new birth of freedom. But I'm here in the land of Lincoln, Illinois, and I'm going to say, let's read Lincoln and treat him as a founding father, a refounding father, every bit as important, maybe more so than Washington, because I believe that we live and move and have our being in Lincoln's Constitution, a Constitution in which we're all equal, female and male, and black and white and brown. I would even say gay and straight. There, I said it.
We have a question from Twitter, Professor Amar, and really gets to kind of the central premise of your book. The question is simply, how much do we need to interpret earlier texts to determine later ones?
Yeah, so that's just what we have been talking about. So let's take the idea of equality. Now, that word doesn't appear in the original Constitution except about states having equal suffrage in the Senate, but not human equality, only state equality. It appears explicitly in the 14th Amendment, but it says no state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny the equal protection. Can the federal government deny equal protection? To what extent do you need to reread the earlier document in light of now the addition of the word equal into the in the 14th Amendment? I actually believe that equality principles apply against the federal government. The court does too. It has a very weird and convoluted thing called reverse incorporation of the Equal Protection Clause via the Due Process Clause. That's a lot of legal gobbledygook, in my view. Here's my more simple thought. The first sentence of the 14th Amendment says everyone born in the United States is born a citizen of the United States and therefore born an equal citizen of the United States. We're all born equal. We're all created equal. This is the textualization of an interpretation, Lincoln's interpretation of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. We're all born equal. We're born equal. This birth equality idea is now in the text of the Constitution. It's a radical idea. It's an Enlightenment idea with profound consequences, that people are born equal. You're born equal whether you're born black or white, or you're firstborn in the family or thirdborn. You shouldn't have more inheritance rights if you're firstborn. If you're born in wedlock, you shouldn't inherit more than if you're born out of wedlock. You shouldn't, be treated as an illegal inferior because you happen to be born female rather than born male. That's why I added gay or straight, because to the extent you might think, and here, science might tell us things that we didn't know 150 years ago. But if you think there's a biological, maybe even birth-based substratum to sexual orientation and identity, if you think, as I tend to, that at least some people might be born with certain sexual tendencies and predispositions, then I say we're born equal, gay and straight. It's a radical idea, and that idea in the 14th Amendment doesn't say no state shall. It just is much broader. It applies against the federal government. But let's remember, at the founding, the federal government is actually supporting slavery in all sorts of ways. Slavery is built into the original Constitution. So how much of the original Constitution do you need to basically sort of, in effect, reinterpret once slavery is now prohibited by the 13th Amendment? And the equal citizenship idea is enshrined as the first sentence of the 14th Amendment. And equal suffrage now comes in the 15th Amendment. And all these amendments say Congress shall have power. So that's, now the core competence of the federal government has changed profoundly. At the founding, here's what we have the federal government for: winning wars, waging foreign policy and foreign affairs, and dealing with interstate competitions that where something that one state does is really maybe having an adverse effect on another state. So the original Constitution is designed, the federal government is designed to do like a few basic things. Raise revenue, basically to finance foreign affairs and war. Have an army, govern the West with the Western territory, turning territories into states, and deal with interstate problems. That's about it. I mean, those are the core competencies. Now, after the Civil War, they have a new core competence to make sure that states don't misbehave in profound ways that can imperil the whole democratic project. That's why I believe the Voting Rights Act is easily and obviously constitutional, because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments weren't some one-off, weird, unique exception only in the 1860s or 1860s and 1960s, but not. No, I think it's a transformative amendment. Now we have a new core federal competence to maintain basic state compliance with human rights and voting rights. So that's reinterpreting the founding, which was more states' rights, in light of the Reconstruction, which is more nationalistic. And that story will continue. Why is the 20th century so much more nationalistic than the 19th? And why do you get the New Deal and the Great Society and Obamacare? Here's why. Because the progressive amendments continue this nationalizing tradition. 16th Amendment says direct taxation, income taxation. That's going to be a huge redistributive engine for the federal government to take money from rich states like Illinois and New York and use it to subsidize the Mississippis and Alabamas of the world. It's going to be redistributive and profoundly nationalizing. That's the 16th Amendment. It's adding power to Congress. And the 17th Amendment is going to say senators are directly elected by citizens. Now they don't answer to state governments anymore, so they're going to be more able to push nationalist projects that state legislatures might not like. And then the 19th Amendment comes along and says women vote. And women vote for the nanny state more than men. We call that the gender gap. 16 plus 17 plus 19 equals the New Deal, the Great Society, and Obamacare. It's going to give you Franklin and Eleanor. It's going to give you, Bill and Hillary. Michelle and Barack and Michelle. So the logical working out of 16 plus 17 plus 19 is a much more powerful federal government than before. And by the way, we're in a bunch of world wars, and we have a huge army and national security apparatus, and that's going to add to federal power. And that's not because, and we really do have a much more integrated interstate and international economy than before. So the founders said everything that's genuinely interstate, the federal government can do, but most stuff wasn't interstate. 95% of people live and die in a 50-mile radius at the founding. They never venture beyond it. Whereas today, we're beaming stuff across the country instantaneously. I just drove yesterday from Connecticut. 90% of GDP really is genuinely. I don't know if I'm not even sure that this came from Ohio, and I'm sure most of the milk comes from Wisconsin. Okay, and that's interesting. Most of the milk in America, because of refrigeration technology. See, my kids think milk comes from cartons, But the founding, you had to have cows in every neighborhood because the milk wouldn't keep. You add refrigeration and rail traffic and other things, and now you have cows in California, Vermont, and Wisconsin, and the rest of us drink from them. So it genuinely is interstate in a way that wasn't true before because of, so you add more genuine interstate commerce and, world wars and America being much more involved in the world and foreign affairs. And a set of Reconstruction amendments, all of which end with congressional power and were the result of a profoundly nationalizing event and traumatizing called the Civil War. And you add 16, 17, and 19 to all of that, and you get the New Deal, the Great Society, and Obamacare. And that's reading earlier stuff in light of later. And those things that are happening are constitutional amendments. And not just appeals, all of them, to living. It's either constitutional amendments or facts on the ground that actually connect with text. The text says if it's genuinely interstate commerce, you can regulate it. And the fact on the ground is we have more genuinely interstate stuff. So isn't this called the Eisenhower Expressway? And that's because, as a matter of national security, Dwight Eisenhower said, you got to evacuate the big cities. We've got to have these big interstate roadways. And that's how I got here. Okay, but that means that Ollie's Barbecue has to serve black people equally with white people because they really are close to an interstate, and they're servicing genuinely, and because the Reconstruction Amendment said the federal government gets to protect black people. So those are examples of reading later constitutional developments and that's probably my biggest disagreement with the conservatives on the court. They claim to pay attention to the Constitution, and my view is they tend to pump up the founding and trivialize everything that happened afterwards, constitutionally.
We have another question from Twitter from Greg Bedell, who is actually a former congressional candidate in the Chicago area. Mm-hmm. And he asked about the Voting Rights Act. Of course, the Supreme Court has weighed in on this since the publication of your book. And you write specific to this case, isn't it just the test of which state should be subject to preclearance that was stricken? Mm-hmm. Enforcement still exists in the Voting Rights Act.
It does. Section 4 was struck down, but other sections still survive. Section 2. In fact, a lot of the justices don't like Section 2, which they think is kind of racially codified. They don't like Section 5, which the very idea of preclearance, but somehow all their animosity gets displaced onto Section 4, even though what they really don't like is the whole idea of preclearance and Section 2 to the extent it creates, critics would say, a kind of racial quota system for elections. So, yes, Greg, you are right. Much of the Voting Rights Act still does survive, and I would predict that it's very possible that you're going to get a new Voting Rights Act. And that's because ordinary citizens believe in voting rights. And actually, a lot of even Republican, and every Democratic politician believes in that. And there are a lot of Republican ordinary voters who don't think that they should have to stand in long lines, and independent voters. So ordinary voters believe in the Voting Rights Act. And the Republican Party voted overwhelmingly for the Voting Rights Act again and again and again. So now, actually, this is going to be a problem for them, frankly. I'm wearing my political science hat now. I do teach political science. Every Democrat's going to be in favor of a new Voting Rights Act. And either Republicans are going to have to say, yeah, we voted for it before, but we really didn't mean it, which is awkward. And that will help them now win a few elections to suppress, but long term, this is a bad strategy, because long term, in the long run, ordinary people believe in voting rights. So they will win now at the expense of losing credibility later on, or they have to explain why they didn't really mean it before, or they actually have to support the thing. I think this will be good if they support the thing. They'll maybe find again their inner Lincoln, which would be good for the Republic and the Republican Party. But it's going to be a civil war within the Republican Party. This is a wedge issue within the Republican Party, and it's actually going to kind of, these 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court, perhaps unwittingly, have created some real political problems for Republican politicians, in fact. Don't be surprised if we do have a new Voting Rights Act. Because remember, the Voting Rights Acts that we have had were signed into law by the renewals by presidents like Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And historically, look, the party that gave us the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments was the Republican Party. Every single Democrat, every single one, votes against the 14th Amendment. Every single one. And every single Republican votes for it except one. His name was Joe Lieberman. No. What I just told you is true. Every single Republican except one votes for the 14th Amendment. Every single Democrat votes against it. It's every bit as partisan as Obamacare was. And by the way, history has recorded that one party was right and one party was wrong about that. And so the mere fact that the parties are disagreeing today doesn't mean that the truth is somewhere in between. History may very well record that one party was right on certain things and the other one was wrong, and I bet you know which one I think was which. Is which today.
Let's take another question from the group here.
You just commented that people support the Voting Rights Act.
Ordinary people.
The ordinary people. I was interested in your last chapter that you talked about the Electoral College.
Yes.
and different ways of changing that process. Mm-hmm. And I think the average person doesn't, first of all, they don't understand it, and second of all, they want it to be maybe a direct vote. Why is that? I'll look at all the amendments and the history that led to each of the amendments, the events that took place. Why have these disputed elections, 1876 to 2000, whenever, not led to that constitutional amendment?
I love that question. So, and it connects. Let me try to connect the dots a little bit. So there isn't very much cultural literacy, and people don't sort of understand that much, ordinary folks, about actually the basic system. Ordinary people understand way better the intricacies of baseball and football. Infield fly rule. Whether the double switch, the double steal. Play action passes. Way better than they understand political intricacies. And if you're like a political junkie, politics is every bit as interesting a game as baseball, which is kind of boring until you're really into. Maybe I shouldn't talk too much about baseball in the land of the Cubs. So
just as bad.
I did pass Comiskey with the 2005 world champion sign there. So ordinary people don't actually understand the intricacies very much. And what they are taught about the Electoral College, in fact, isn't true. And what I was taught by my teachers, and I don't mean no disrespect to them, here's what I was taught, and raise your hand if this is what you were taught. We have an electoral college because it's a balance between big and small states. Okay, some of you were taught that. Now that's baloney. If it's a balance between big or small states, simple question, why does the big state guy always win? In all of American history, we've had only 3 small state presidents: Zachary Taylor, Bill Clinton, Franklin Pierce. That's it. Where does George Washington come from? The answer is Virginia. Is that a big state or small state? The answer is the biggest. And then 8 years, and then Thomas Jefferson, Virginia; James Madison, Virginia; James Monroe, Virginia. 32 of the first 36 years is the biggest state. For the other 4, it's John Adams, which is from the 2nd or 3rd biggest state, depending on how you count, from Massachusetts. And then John Quincy. Big state guys always win, and people understand it's not a big state, small state balance. Yes, House versus Senate was a big state, small state balance, but not the Electoral College. So that's actually baloney, even though people are taught that. Now, I was taught that they didn't have a direct election of the president. They had this Electoral College because they were kind of skeptical, many of the framers, of democracy, of mob rule and rule by the people. And they wanted to rein in the democratic successes, and the Electoral College would be this sort of filtered system. Baloney. It's just not true. They put the Constitution to a special vote. They begin with the words, "We the people." There are no property qualifications to be a member of the House or the Senate or even the presidency, which there are property qualifications for every governorship. They begin with the words, "We the people," and they actually mean that. The new Congress the House is directly elected in a way that the Articles of Confederation wasn't. They believe in direct election of governors. They proudly call themselves Democrats. The party that the dominant political party in America in the antebellum era calls itself the Democrat Party, and it's version 2.0 of a party that called itself first the Republican Party, and there's no difference between those words. Res publica, Republican, is Latin for rule by the people. Demoskratia is rule by the demos, by the people. It's just Greek or Latin. It's the same thing. The party, Thomas Jefferson's party, called themselves the Democrats, the Democratic Republicans, the Republican Democrats. Same difference. Here's what James Wilson, who writes the words "We the people," one of the first 6 justices on the Supreme Court, founder of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, greatest lawyer in America, signs both the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, plays a role basically roughly akin to Madison. Here's what he says. His defense of the Constitution in 1787 and 88 is probably even more influential than the Federalist Papers, even though it's faded in history. Here's what he says. The Constitution is, quote, purely democratical, and, quote, the democratic principle is carried into every part of government. They are proud Democrats. That word is not a nasty word. That was all baloney. And I can tell you where you were taught all this, because I know I've traced it, wrestled it to the ground. So they believe in democracy. Republic is the same root word. They believe in we the people, and putting the Constitution to a vote, and directly electing governors and members of the House of Representatives. And the Electoral College can't be this filtered thing. They meet for one day all across the country. The one day is not enough time to deliberate. And they're pre-selected and have been from the beginning. They're basically told, whom to vote for by the voters. And we have voters picking them for, basically telling them in advance who you're going to vote for from day one. And we amend the thing in the 12th Amendment when all of this has already been clear, that the big state guy is winning every time, and we actually do have elections, and the voters are telling the electors how to vote. You do not have electoral college because they didn't believe in democracy. You do not have an electoral college because it's a big state, small state balance. And you're not telling your students this, most of them, because we have the electoral college for one reason, one word. What's the word? James Carville, the economy's stupid. What's the word? Why do we have the electoral college? One word. It's slavery, stupid. It's slavery, unambiguously. It's just not really very debatable. Here's why you have electoral college. Because in a world of direct election, the South loses every time because slaves can't vote. But in an electoral college system, you get to count your slaves, albeit at a discount, 3/5. Now, who's going to be the big winner? A big state with a lot of slaves. Can you spell Virginia? Virginia has fewer free people than Pennsylvania in 1800. Way fewer voters than Pennsylvania in 1800, way more electoral votes because of the Electoral College. You just have two elections between the Virginian and the Massachusetts guy in 1796 and 1800. And the Southerners vote for the Southerner and the Northerners vote for the Northerner twice. And the swing jurisdiction there, the Ohio of that time was New York. That's where North Massachusetts. Here are we have an electoral college to avoid geographic candidates. That's what there's always been it's north against south, and now it's the coast against the center. That's always, the states that voted for Lincoln almost the same as the ones that voted for Obama. He's recreated the old Republican coalition, except now the Yankees are the Democrat Party and the Confederates are the Republican Party. It's north against south. It's over, and Thomas Jefferson wins that second time. Even though, without 3/5, he loses that election. And every Northerner knows that the only reason Thomas Jefferson's getting elected, he's riding to the executive mansion on the backs of his slaves. That because of 3/5, the southern states that vote for him are counting more than they otherwise would. And the Federalists understand all this. They're every bit as sore losers as Democrats were after Bush versus Gore and Florida and all of that. Gary Wills makes that case powerfully in his book about Jefferson called Negro President. I give you lots of data in the last book on all of that. So why do we have now? The question is, well, we don't have slavery anymore. And we actually believe in one person, one vote. So why do, and the answer is there isn't maybe a good reason today. But your students will not know that if they don't know why we had it in the first place and that the founders were great in all sorts of ways, and I celebrate them, but they failed fundamentally on slavery. And the system almost died because of this cancer. And Abraham Lincoln from this state is the first anti-slavery president sort of ever. Before Abraham Lincoln, not a single president ever says the following thing. Slavery is wrong and we should eventually get rid of it. Not one. Not a single cabinet officer says that while a cabinet officer or while president. John Quincy Adams says stuff against slavery only after he's out of office for the presidency and only have to get Massachusetts voters to vote for him. Why don't presidents say this? You can't get elected if you say it. Who's John Quincy Adams' vice president? It's John C. Calhoun. Okay, because of the Electoral College, you have to kiss ass up to the South. Okay, every single president is a Southerner or Northern man of Southern sympathies. The whole system is rigged toward the South, and the first time an anti-slavery person actually wins, the South walks, okay, but we don't tell our students all of that. That's actually the history of the Electoral College. It's a history deeply complicit with slavery. That the founders did many things right, but they did this one thing wrong. They made slavery extremely powerful, thanks to the 3/5 clause, which was built into the Electoral College and not just the House of Representatives. And it was a cancer that grew and grew and grew and almost killed us. They're not, and the Electoral College today is a remnant of this. I'll give you one final point to illustrate that. The Electoral College is a world designed to make it safe for disfranchisement. Whether Virginia enfranchises many people or few people, it still gets the same number of electoral votes. That's a bad system. Today, when Virginia makes it difficult for people to vote on Election Day, they don't take a hit. in Amar's world, direct election, the more people come out from Virginia, the more Virginia is playing a role. States would have incentives to actually compete to make it easier for people to vote. This would be a good thing. In 1900, some states, in 1915, some states are letting women vote, others aren't. And from the Electoral College point of view, it doesn't matter. If we'd had direct election, think about it. If Illinois lets women vote, it's just doubled its clout in the presidential election. We would have created incentives to democratize much earlier. The Electoral College was designed, actually, to make the world safe for the slaveocracy. And you don't teach your students. So it's not that they were anti-democrats. It's not. That doesn't count. There was one particular way in which they were kind of anti-democratic, and that's that they were complicit with slavery. One final way of putting all that. My claim in this last book was the Constitution is more democratic, more slavocratic, and more about national security than you thought. And if you can't remember all of that, just go to an ATM and look at whose picture comes out at you, again and again and again. And it's Andrew Jackson. And that is the antebellum Constitution. Democratic, he's a proud Democrat. He's a man of the people, low-born. His party's called the Democrat Party. But he's also pro-slavery, and he's fiercely national security. He beat the Brits in New Orleans. He doesn't like Native Americans. He's anti-foreigner, anti-black. That's the original Constitution, and it fails because of slavery, and it's reborn. And our Constitution today is Lincoln's Constitution. And Lincoln's Constitution is about equality, and if it's about equality, why shouldn't every vote count equally? That's actually what we believe today: one person, one vote. But your students will not even begin to have, to think about that if we don't tell them the true story of the Electoral College, the real historical story.
Excellent. Another question from Twitter is from Colin Bornman, and it's a question appropriate for this group. Is Madison truly the father of the Bill of Rights?
So Paul Finkelman, who's a very distinguished historian, writes an article saying, I think the subtitle is James Madison, the Bill of Rights, a reluctant paternity. And Madison basically comes somewhat late to the Bill of Rights project. So here's basically the story as I would tell it. I don't say this in print, but so at the end of the Philadelphia Convention, George Mason, who's becoming increasingly critical and cranky, proposes a Bill of Rights and gets voted down. He says, let's add a Bill of Rights. And they basically say, it'd take too much time. He says, no, wouldn't it just take a few hours? I did it for Virginia. I could compose it again. And they said, no, it'd take too much time. And they basically, without a lot of thought, voted down. Now why did that happen? Because I think, in retrospect, this was a huge mistake. There are not that many people there, and smaller groups can make big mistakes. Then if you're a Democrat, I am, small d, you believe that there's a wisdom of the people, that more heads are better than one, that there's something epistemically advantageous of getting a lot of people in a conversation. That's why Wikipedia is actually really brilliant. Just because you get a lot of people in a conversation. If you're a Democrat, you believe in that. And a small number of people, so they goof. And that's what's going to happen when it actually goes out to the people, is they're going to say, dudes, you forgot the rights, and they goof. But why did they goof? Because a small number of people, they missed it. And they were afraid it would take a lot of time. And they're frankly just, I know you're not going to believe it on a day like today, but they're just hot and tired. And they've been there for a long time, and it's, and I'll even add something. Please don't record this, but they're hot and tired and horny. They've been away from their wives for a very long time, and they want to go home. And that's actually, and sometimes you don't think straight. When you're hot in your hand, you want to go home. I'm being a little bit flip, but they want to see their children. They want to, see their wives. They want to go back home. Who wouldn't? I'm already homesick. I've been away for a day. It's a very natural thing. So that was a blunder. Now, they get attacked by this. The Anti-Federalists don't like much of the Constitution, but this is what has traction. So they say no Bill of Rights. And Madison, stupidly, for a while, keeps trying to defend why it was not a stupid thing to have omitted this. And he sort of defends this for a while, and then he realizes that's not such a great strategy. So in order to get the thing ratified in places like Virginia, he says, if you're willing to here's the problem. We can't vote. If we vote the thing down, we're stuck with the Articles of Confederation. We can't make any changes to that, at least legally, unless all the states say yes. And Rhode Island will never say yes to anything. So tell you what, vote for the Constitution. Its best feature is that it's more amendable. That even if we got almost everything wrong, it's open source. We can fix it, and we can do a 2.0. It's much easier to fix than this old thing. So vote for it, and we will respectfully consider your amendments. I, James Madison, he informally tells people, okay, maybe. Then he has to get himself elected to Congress. And to get elected to Congress, he has to tell the voters, in effect, listen, I'm no longer opposed to a Bill of Rights. I'll give it very, I'll help work for it. And then, because he's a man of his word and he's got to face re-election very soon, he pushes the thing forward. And he does so pretty vigorously, even though other people think, look, we've got other things to do. We've got to create a mint, and we've got to raise an army, and have a tax system, and customs laws. We've got a ton of things to do, and you're proposing amending this thing that we haven't even launched yet. And Madison's saying, no, we've got to do this. It's a reluctant paternity, but so why is he pushing? Because he made a promise. Because he's a politician who actually believes that if he doesn't meet his promise, he could fail to get reelected. He got elected, and the district was gerrymandered against him, and he won by this much, and he's going to lose next time if he didn't keep his promise. And he wants to get the anti-federalists in Rhode Island and North Carolina on board. Let them save face. They say they want a Bill of Rights, give them a Bill of Rights, and then they can come in without feeling like they're losers. A whole bunch of people voted against the Constitution. Give them a thing that's a sop to them, and they can come in and save face, and they can be part of the project. Now, because I don't agree with all of what they want to do, I'll control the amendments and sort of I'll control the agenda and only have the ones that I actually think don't really destroy the project. And if I don't do this, they may call for another constitutional convention, and then they'll be in control of the agenda. So it's in very much my interest to try to bring along the dissenters within the individual states that are already part of the Union, to try to bring in Rhode Island and North Carolina, because I promised to do it. So yes, I would say he is the father of the Bill of Rights. It's a kind of a late and reluctant paternity, but it's not wrong to give him some important credit. But the Anti-Federalists are the other parents of this. And the Bill of Rights is a compromise between the states' rightists and the nationalists, what they can agree on.
You talk about some important texts that we need to see as constitutional texts, like the Gettysburg Address and Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. How would you think about certain foreign policy declarations like the Monroe Doctrine or the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine? Are those constitutional texts?
I think the Monroe Doctrine is a hugely constitutional text. And I think, and what I try to argue in Chapter 1 of this book, is that the very concept of the Constitution emerges for foreign policy reasons having everything to do with Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, and that you see prototypes of this in all the early Federalist Papers, Federalist 2, especially Federalist 4 to 6, summarized in 8. So let me tell you what the original constitutional project is all about and why. 95% of it is a national security project. It's a war machine. That's what constitutions are. Whether they understand themselves to be or not, if they don't actually protect the polity from external invasion, they simply cease to exist in a Darwinian ecosystem. So they have to be sort of adaptive to the threats in a dangerous world. So here's Publius's argument. Because the Federalist Papers are one of the things that I say are canonical. The most cited Federalist Papers are the early Federalist Papers, and they make an argument that none of you teach. To the extent you teach a Federalist Paper, you teach, and raise your hands if this is true, 10, 51, 78. Wow, 39 is, but how many basically teach 10? Right. And do you know that not a single person paid any attention to 10 for the first 150 years or so, 130 years? That's proved by a historian named Douglas Adair in an article called The 10th Federalist Revisited, that before a man named Charles Beard came along, none, not just at the founding, that no one paid any attention to 10, but no one for the next 100 years did. And they paid attention to a lot of Federalist Papers, never cited by anyone for anything significant. And Beard comes along and says this is all about rich against poor, it's class warfare stuff, and they see in 10, and they even admit it's about protecting minorities, including property minorities, and this is Marx avant la lettre. That's Beard, and Beard is full of it. Okay, Beard says it's basically an anti-democratic project, and I give you overwhelming evidence in Chapter 1 of America's Constitutional Biography that Beard was wrong. In 8 of the 13 states, property qualifications were lowered or eliminated in this vote on the Constitution's adoption compared to what they were ordinarily. And before I wrote this, only, apart from the people that I told, only one human being, I think, actually knew that fact. His name was Charles Beard, and he suppressed it from the readers. And I give you documentation of that in the footnotes of this book based on Forrest McDonald's work on Beard. Beard basically said it's rich against poor, and the Constitution's framers are kind of trying to line their own pockets. They owe a lot of government debt, and it's all economics and stuff. Hogwash. It's more democratic than anything that existed before on planet Earth. People actually got to vote on it. It was a fair vote, and they voted against it in North Carolina and Rhode Island, and again, fewer property qualifications than for ordinary elections, and you can vote for the House of Representatives, and you didn't get to vote on the Articles of Confederation for that, and there are no property qualifications to be a member of the House, even though there are for most state legislatures, to be a member of the Senate, even though there is for every upper house. Pennsylvania doesn't have an upper house. No property qualification to be president, even though there's for every governor. Pennsylvania doesn't have a governor. So it's not rich against poor. That's not what it's about. It's a national security project. The closer you are to the fighting end of the American, and if James Carville were around, or Paul Begala, or Karl Rove, and they were actually saying, who's for it and who's against it. Yeah, George Washington's rich, he's for it. George Mason's richer, he's against it. Yeah, Madison's for it, he's rich. The Lees in Virginia are every bit as rich, and they're against it. Elbridge Gerry is the second richest guy probably there. He's against it. It's not rich against poor. It's the cities against the center, because the closer you are to the rest of the world, actually the more with it you are. It's young people against old people. The younger you are, the more you're willing to actually vote for this audacious experiment. And it's basically the veterans. Again, the closer you are to the fighting end of the American Revolution, the more you're for this Constitution. Here's why. Because what's being proposed is nothing less than world government for the new world. It'd be as if today someone said, well, let's have a president of the world and an army of the world and a legislature of the world. And there's no way you would ever vote for that, ever. Except there's only one thing that could ever make you vote for that. And in a word, it's Martians. Yes, if they were coming, you'd say, well, we don't love the Chinese, but they are Homo sapiens, so what the hell? And that is the argument of Publius. And Federalist 10 is not about that at all. It's about the class issue, and so Beard makes it a big deal, but no one talks about 10. Adair has proved this, and the early Federalist Papers are cited everywhere, and they're all about the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, and here's the argument, just so we're clear on why we have a Constitution. It's a national security imperative that connects to democracy. And here's how it goes. Look around the world. Who's free in all the world, apart from us in the United States? The Brits, to some extent, and the Swiss, and that's it. That's it. And the Dutch are in the process of losing their republic. Now, why? What do the Swiss have in common? Not language, they got 4, not religion, they got 2, which is plenty enough to kill each other over, for 100 years in Europe, Protestants and Catholics. They've got the Alps. They've got a natural rampart, a great wall that's a great fortification. The Brits, they've got a natural moat. Naturally, they've got defensible borders. And how do they accomplish that? By creating a perfect union of Scotland and England, because Hadrian's Wall is no Great Wall of China, is no Alps, it's not a defensible border. So before the union of Scotland and England, Publius says all of this very clearly. Read it. Federalist 5, all summarized in Federalist 8. Before the union of Scotland and England, Scots were always fighting the English, and the English were fighting the Scots, and Mel Gibson was coming down and whomping, and the French were intervening, and liberty is not safe when you live in an armed camp. Now, you unify Scotland and England. Now it's an island. You only need a navy. A navy doesn't threaten people domestically. It has to be able to beat the Spanish Armada. You can be free. And now, my fellow Americans, this is what Publius says. We have 2 choices. Because the rest of the world, you got a land border with someone else. You build up an army. They build up a bigger one. You build up a bigger one still. And these armies are used by strongmen military thugs to suppress people domestically. That's the world. Swiss avoid it because they got the Alps, and the Brits avoid it because they got a moat. My fellow Americans, says Publius, here are our choices. 13 nation states. And we're going to fight each other over who controls the West, because there's gold out there in Chicago and California and other places. And we're going to fight each other over that. And Britain's going to intervene and play us off one against the other. This is not going to be good. We can have 3 or 4 confederacies, same problem. We're going to fight each other. Or we can create a perfect union on the model of Scotland and England. because that is our model. See, the Federalist 5. And now we'll have this vast moat called the Atlantic Ocean that will protect us. We'll need a tiny army, 5,000 people, not enough to threaten anyone's liberty. We'll kick the Brits out with 5,000 people. Mad, Anthony Wayne. That's why Fallen Timbers is huge. Because we have to kick the Indians out because they're actually supporting the Brits in these forts in the Northwest that are preventing us from getting all the fur trade and all the rest. Because there's gold in our hills, but we got to kick the Brits out first. And so we'll kick the Brits out, kick the Spanish out, kick the French out, kill the Indians, take all their land. Manifest destiny, Monroe Doctrine, from sea to shining sea, steal all this land, Chicago, Erie Canal, and we will be hegemons in our hemisphere, and no one will mess with the United States of America. And that's why you're free. Okay, it's a national security project, and it works brilliantly, and it's baked into, the Federalist Papers say this really clearly. Andrew Jackson is all about that. He's manifested. Thomas Jefferson betrays every constitutional principle. He's got stupid ones, but thank God he betrays them, because they are stupid, when he acquires Louisiana, because now we're kicking the French out, and the project is actually secure. The most important, Marbury versus Madison isn't the most important constitutional decision ever. It's not even the most important constitutional decision of 1803. The Louisiana Purchase is far more consequential, and it's about Monroe Doctrine, manifest destiny. So now, I said, 95% of the Constitution can be explained by a simple national security imperative. The closer you are to the fighting end of the American Revolution, the more you know that you almost lost that war and we're going to lose the next one, and you better vote for what Washington is saying. Because Washington doesn't want everyone to understand how militarily weak he is. He leads a guerrilla campaign in which, he's winning like with triple bank shots. Yorktown was like this miracle. But he's way weaker than his enemies understand. Okay, and we're going to lose the next time around. We need an army. There's no money in the coffer. We can't pay our debts from the last war. No one's going to lend us, for the next one. So here's what we need. Small army to kick the Indians out and do all this stuff. That's going to require a revenue source. We can't requisition the states because they won't pay, and when Virginia doesn't pay, you can't put it in jail, so we need direct taxation of individuals through customs and other things. That's not going to have any legitimacy for taxing people individually unless individuals are represented. See, when states are taxed to requisition, states are represented. That's the Articles of Confederation, but they don't pay. It's like the UN today. The U.S. doesn't pay. So we're going to have an army that needs money. States are going to have, individuals are going to have to pay. You need a revenue stream. They're going to have to be represented. So now we have a House of Representatives. And it's going to have to do foreign affairs and treaties, which really need to be enforced, because otherwise the Brits will play us off one against another, and we'll start killing each other and look like the continent of Europe. So we have to have one united face, negotiating, one commerce. Now we're creating a real legislature with real laws. So this is much more dangerous. So we got to break it up into two, like all the state legislatures are, except Pennsylvania. We have to have an independent executive to check it. All the states are pretty much out of that, except Pennsylvania. Independent judiciary. The independent judiciary will also be good for national security. It'll help protect British creditors from being abused in ways that will provoke war. Unitary executive will help us win wars. So now we got bicameralism, 3 branches of government. Who are the big, much more powerful federal government with war competences and foreign affairs and international commerce? Who's the loser in this project? State governments. They're never going to go for this because they're parochial little people who don't understand the world, don't understand how we almost lost the revolution. They have good intentions, but they're stupid. So, and they will vote against it, so we have to go over their heads because they have a lot of democratic legitimacy. They waged the American Revolution. They go back 150 years. House of Burgesses has been up and running since the 1620s. They've got a lot of legitimacy and credibility, but they won't go for it. We have to go over their heads, summon into existence a thing called We the People of the United States, put it to a genuinely popular vote, of a sort never been seen before. And if we lose, we lose. But if we win, we will have more legitimacy because we don't want to do an armed coup d'etat. So we want to be like Mandela or Gandhi, actually, Václav Havel, have sort of people power. We want to have more legitimacy for this revolution that we're planning. Now, ordinary people will not vote for this thing unless they're democratic sweeteners in the thing, like no property qualifications and all the rest. So it's a fundamentally pro-populist, not Beard at all, pro-democratic national security project. And you shouldn't have property qualifications because unproperty people fought for the American Revolution. And if you fight, you should get to vote. That's the story. And yes, it's all about the minority. Now, final point. Makes no sense today. And you have to teach your students this. Our Constitution is premised on old world versus new world, isolationist America. We sit behind our moats. We kill all the Indians. We grab all the land, and Europe will kill each other, and to hell with them, and we're just going to be, free here. And for 150 years, Americans are free, not because of the Bill of Rights, which means nothing on the ground, in fact. Courts don't enforce it. Not because you have no standing army in peacetime. And you don't have to. So you're rich and you're free because you're not paying for it. That's the world for the first 150 years. And the last time foreigners dropped blood on American soil before 9/11 is the War of 1812. This works brilliantly, this project. But it's not our world. It's not our world today because you got intercontinental missiles and nuclear submarines. And as late as World War II, 20 million Russians die in Russia. And Berlin is in rubble, and Dresden is firebombed, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and bombs rain over Britain, and Paris is occupied, and it's only Pearl Harbor here because these vast moats. And we try to recreate that with Star Wars, but it doesn't work. So today, though, we no longer have the geographic isolation. We have a huge military structure we're paying for the rest of the world. The rest of the world is democratic in a way that it wasn't before. They're becoming Americans. India looks like America today. So now we're competing against ourselves, people emulating America. They've demilitarized. Good for the world, hooray. We are paying for all this stuff. So that's actually what's been happening, why we're evening up with the rest. And it can no longer be old world versus new world. Our Constitution is premised on an isolationist Monroe Doctrine, separate hemisphere idea, which we would be, the big dogs. And that doesn't make any sense given international terrorism and global climate change, in case you missed the weather today, and the internet and the GATT. And the fact that we are far more international today, that Yale College and Chicago is like and New York are where the world comes together. The rest of the world is becoming American. We're becoming international. This Monroe Doctrine thing is deeply baked into the constitutional cake, but it doesn't make sense going forward. And yes, your students need to know that too, that the challenge for them, their generation, is to think seriously about world government and world governance systems to deal with genuine, because the Martians are coming. It's called pandemic viruses, and the melting of the polar ice caps. And yes, these are global problems and international terrorism. These are Martians that can only be, addressed with common solutions. So they need to be the Publiuses of their, world. What Publius did, which is create, a vision of a new world government for a new world, they need to, because the Monroe Doctrine doesn't quite make sense when the world is much smaller, and it doesn't make as much sense to say the new world hemispheres are different than the old world hemispheres. Long answer, but it's a deep question about the Monroe Doctrine, and it shows why Beard is wrong. It's not about the rich against the poor. It's a national security project.
So I'm hoping we have time for two.
I'll be less filibustering.
Maybe brief responses. We have about 6 minutes left in our simulcast. First one comes from Lou Larson, who we talked about today, the president of the James Madison Foundation. And he, first of all, wants to say hello to all the fellows in the room and throughout the country watching the simulcast. And he's watching himself with the Madison Foundation staff in Alexandria, Virginia. And his question relates to the 3/5 compromise.
Yes.
And it's perhaps a simple question, maybe not, asking whether the 3/5 compromise relates to representation, or is it more of a tax issue?
They tried to hide. I have a discussion of the 3/5 in some detail because I think it's basically what undoes the entire Constitution. They did so many things right, they get one little number wrong. But that number compounds. It's like locking in the wrong compound interest rate. No, that would never happen to anyone in this room. But every decade, there's a new census, and slaves breed, and the 3/5 become bigger and bigger, and the South is getting more than its fair share in every election going forward. And it's the cancer that grows and grows and grows and almost kills the country, because it's going to empower the James Buchanans of the world and the Franklin Pierces and the John C. Calhouns at the expense of the Abe Lincolns and even the Stephen Douglases. It's going to corrupt Douglas because he's got to appeal to Southerners, and that's because 3/5 overrepresents the South, and it's this cancer that almost kills the country. They try to disguise it by making it about linking it to the taxation issue, but only direct taxation, and almost never have we had direct taxation in America. Almost all the revenue comes from customs. Early on, comes from customs and land sales. Later on, from income taxes, which, although the Supreme Court called direct taxes, really aren't direct taxes. So they tried to camouflage all this by making it seem about taxes, but it was all about representation and over-representing the South. And that story is told in critics would say too much detail in this, but I read, there's a book review saying, I thought this was a book on the Constitution, and it's all about slavery. Yes, it is, because the Constitution was way, way more about slavery than we've reckoned. And people who write about slavery have realized this, Paul Finkelman, William Weecheck, and others. But this book tries to be the first mainstream general book about the Constitution that actually says slavery is looming way larger than you thought. It's at the heart of the Electoral College in a way that you didn't. Who's the dominant figure in antebellum America, in Tocqueville's America? It is Andrew Jackson. It's the age of Jackson, and he is, national security aggressive, and a man of the people, but ruthlessly pro-slavery. That the Constitution will give you Jackson's America, which is Tocqueville's America, which self-destructs because of slavery. Was there an alternative? Because I think you have to get everyone on board. Because if you don't get the South on board, then you're going to have to fight a war between North and South, and Britain will play North off against the South. Yes, there was an alternative. I explain how you could have avoided the ultimate civil war. In a nutshell, you could have said 3/5 now, heck, 4/5, 5/5, but after 1808, 2/5 or 1/5, and after 1876, 0/5. The numbers are negotiable, but and slavery isn't one thing; it's a whole series of things. How you count slaves for the House of Representatives, how you count them for the Electoral College, fugitive slaves, slavery in the West, the international slave trade, slavery in the States. It's about many things, but for representation, what you had to do is put it on a path of ultimate extinction. We accommodate you now, but not forever. In the same way that we say you can import slaves up to 1808, but after that we can prohibit that. The way the arc of history bends toward justice, is gradual. You have to slowly get rid of these accommodations of slavery. And there were ways to do it, and they didn't do it. Lincoln's proposal, he says slavery is wrong, and I'm not going to get rid of it immediately. But I'm going to come up with a long-term plan for getting rid of it. He says it might take 100 years, but let's come up with a long-term plan. I will accommodate with evil today if in the end we can achieve a more just future on the horizon. And that's what you could have done with 3/5, and they didn't. And one small mistake, but it was almost the death of us.
So McCormick Foundation has a mobile museum that we take out to schools throughout the Chicagoland area called Freedom Express. And it's very much centered on the First Amendment. And students explore their freedoms through highly interactive exhibits. The educator that goes out to schools, name is Neelam, and she tweets that student visitors of Freedom Express sometimes ask, why are my rights different than adult rights? How would you respond to that question?
I'd invite the student to, this is going to sound so self-serving, but to read my next book, which has already been written. It's a series of lectures that I gave around the country. It's called The Law of the Land, a Constitutional Travelogue. And it's 10 lectures given in 10 spots. In each spot, I talk about someone or something from that state that has a particular sort of constitutional significance. So I give a lecture at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and it's called Abraham Lincoln and the American Union, of course, because if I'm coming here, I have to talk. And it's all about this geostrategic vision of the Union, which Lincoln shared. And Lincoln said a bunch of what I said actually in explaining why you can't allow the South to leave, because it's part of a geostrategic landmass because there's no defensible border between southern Illinois and what's below it. And the entire region from the Appalachians to the Rockies drains through the Mississippi, and you can't let the South have control of the Mississippi River and New Orleans. And so it's very much in keeping with this geostrategic vision. So that's my lecture on Lincoln. And the end of chapter 1 actually ends with a long quote from Lincoln about all of this. But I give a lecture in Des Moines, Iowa, And so, of course, I talk about the Tinker case. And that I begin that lecture with the story of how I became a constitutional law professor. In retrospect, one never knows, but I think an important step along that road was that I was editorial editor of my high school newspaper, and I published some anti-Nixon satires, and I thought they were very funny, but not everyone shared my sense of humor, and in particular the principal didn't, and so he actually censored them, and my teacher, my journalism advisor, and my English teachers supported me, and they actually gave me a book by the ACLU on the rights of students, and I read up about this amazing case called Tinker versus Des Moines that did talk about rights of students, and so I kind of got involved and I mobilized a student protest, which was much more fun than doing homework, of course. And I'm sure a pain in the butt, but I actually was kind of learning civics in a way, and we have to encourage our students, we have to channel their rebellious instincts into things that are ultimately, even though they might not know it, really productive. They think they're being really rebellious, but in fact, we're turning them into good citizens in a way. So I would tell, and if the student wants to, I'll send them a copy of the chapter. I'm happy to email them. But this is a chapter all about the Tinker case, but it begins with some autobiographical meditations on how I came to think a lot about the Constitution when I encountered this really amazing case called Tinker versus Des Moines, which is about the rights of students. And yes, they're not exactly the same as the rights of adults. And my friend Ken Starr litigates and wins the Frederick versus Morse bong hits for Morse versus Frederick for Jesus case. That and he is my friend. I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican, but we co-teach together, and I hold him in very high regard. So the story of student rights is a very interesting one. They're not exactly the same as adults for a variety of reasons in loco parentis and their Fourth Amendment rights. You know about the TLO, New Jersey versus TLO case, but they do have rights. They're different, but they do have rights. And Tinker, I think, is an epically important case, and for me, very autobiographically, because I think, in retrospect, I do what I do today in part because of that case, and I know about that case because I had a couple of teachers, who were really like amazing educators and actually stood with me even against the administration at some cost because they actually were trying to teach me to how to sort of ultimately be a grown-up and act like a grown-up, and these satires probably were not in perfect taste, and so I'm where I am today thanks to people like you. Actually, amazing educators who try to guide me in certain ways.
Fantastic. Well, that's just a great place to end. Very much appreciate Professor Amar, you driving all the way to Chicago from Connecticut to be with our group today and our group across the country. Thanks to all the folks who've watched online, joined the conversation on Twitter, read the book from afar and near, and participated in this very illuminating conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.